Amen. Please be seated.
Good morning. The last thing I want to do is embarrass anybody. And I know enough to know I don't have a hearing aid, but I know that often the person with a hearing aid is the last person to know that their battery is screaming. If you're sitting around a person that's happening to, one of the kindest things you could do would just be to gently let them know that. And I think all of us would appreciate that. I want to put in my 2 cents about life groups. I want to encourage every member of our congregation to plug into a life group, to make a commitment this year to be a part of life groups. It'll bless your life. And you have choice of people back there to be a part of their group. Go make a decision to be that, to do that this year. And not only will you encourage yourself, you'll encourage other people. And by the way, that is a part of being Christ-like, is to be an encourager to others too. So I want to encourage you in that. Well, one day on the subway, there was an unintentional eavesdropper because there was another guy on the subway that was making a cell phone call. And this eavesdropper overheard him say in this conversation, "Sir, could you use an honest, hardworking, visionary employee?" "Oh, you already have one? Well, thank you for your time." And he hung up, and a big smile came to his face. Well, the unintentional eavesdropper, he had to know why was it. So he asked this guy, "I couldn't help but overhearing you. Am I right in thinking that you just had a job refused, that you were just rejected?" And the guy said, "Well, yes, sir." And he said, "Then why do you have such a big smile on your face?" And the guy said, "Because I'm the employee that they're so pleased with. I was just checking up on myself." How many of you are currently employed? This message is going to be directly to you today, and I want to encourage the unemployed here, that's not what I meant to say, the retired. I want to encourage you who are retired to encourage these employed people about this message today. And we'll just throw school in with being employed, okay? Because it is such a big part of our week. Those of you who are currently employed, imagine if you were to disguise your voice and call your boss and ask the same questions that we just shared in that illustration. What might your boss's response be? Not much is said from the pulpit in my experience, and I've been guilty of it too, but not much is said about our occupations. Not much is said about our work, and yet we spend so much of our lives, so much of our week at work. And so I think we need to give it more attention, don't you? Maybe. I'll just sit down. There's a couple of reasons I want to give you for this being the cause of needed attention. The first is at work, our character is on display. Our behavior on Sunday mornings in this building is not where the depth of our discipleship is going to be displayed. It's going to be in how we behave at work. The people we work beside, the people we work with, probably know more about our character than does just about anybody in this room. It's on the job that our negative character traits come out. Laziness, deceptiveness, dishonesty, gossip, pettiness, disloyalty, discord, impatience. But it's also on the job where our positive characteristics come out too. Ambition and punctuality and honesty and a sense of humor and kindness, enthusiasm, teamwork, loyalty. Secondly, the pressure of work best reveals who we really are. At work, our energies are often drained because we put so much of our energies into our work. Our job demands that. And then there's the pressure of working around people. And sometimes that can be difficult, can't it? People who might be petty, people who might use profanity, people who gossip. And then there's the constant pressure of downsizing or reorganization that so many of the places that we work go through. Maybe it's your misfortune to work for a boss who's unreasonable. But I'm convinced that, picture that I have a sponge in my hand and the sponge is full of something. The only way to find out what's in that sponge is to put pressure on it. When you put pressure on it, it reveals what's in the sponge. And in the same way, it's pressures of our lives that really reveal to those around us what's really inside of us. So I want to begin with a theological question. Is God present everywhere? Would that include your workplace? Sure. Is faithfulness at work less important than faithfulness in this church building? Obviously not. Does character take a vacation when we go to work tomorrow? No. And I think there's something dishonest, even duplicitous, about the way that unfortunately many Christians approach this idea, because many Christians in their minds and in their actions believe that life is divided up between the secular and the holy, the secular and the sacred. It's like two different lives. We put on the sacred when we come to church. We put on the secular during the work week. And it's like we're living as two different people. That separation of sacred from secular, I believe, robs work of its intended meaning. Work is not a consequence of the fall in Genesis chapter 3. Work was intended by God to bless our lives. What Genesis chapter 3 brought is all the problems that are associated with it, like thorns and all these other things if you're a farmer. So, I contend that all of life, for a believer in Jesus Christ, all of life is sacred. And on the job, we are Christ's ambassadors. Our workplace is our greatest opportunity. It's our greatest mission field. And we ought to be, every person in here who is employed ought to be the very best employee wherever you work. Because as we're going to see in a minute, you're not just working for your boss. You're really working for the Lord. So, when it comes to character on the job, we can learn a lot from Joseph. Joseph didn't compartmentalize his life. Joseph lived an integrated life of integrity. He was the top government employee in Egypt. During a critical time of transition. So as we pick up the story, we left it last week with Joseph's father and his brothers and their family all coming to Egypt. They had this grand family reunion. And that region of the world was now probably 2 years into a 7-year famine. I want you to imagine, especially for people that didn't have grocery stores like we do, and they were dependent upon their crops and such. I want you to imagine the insecurity of being deep into a famine like that. I want you to imagine the fear. I want you to imagine even the panic. Think of the heavy responsibility, the heavy load that Joseph had on his shoulders. And so what did he do? Well, first thing, Joseph planned ahead wisely. Join me in Genesis chapter 46 and verse 31. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, they tend livestock, and they've brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, "What is your occupation?" you should answer, "Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did." Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen. For all shepherds, catch this is important, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. I want you to notice here that Joseph does not presume upon Pharaoh. Joseph doesn't say, "Hey, Pharaoh, you owe me one because after all, I had the foresight to see us through this famine." He doesn't do that. There's none of this philosophy that even preachers have told me through the years, this is how you need to handle things. It's always easier to get forgiveness than it is to get permission. You ever heard that one? There may be a nugget of truth to that, but can I also tell you that is a trust buster? It really is a trust buster. And Joseph doesn't do that. He keeps Pharaoh informed. He proceeds with his plan, or he presents his plan before Pharaoh, and he gets the final approval of Pharaoh before he does it. He didn't expect any special treatment. He also anticipated that Pharaoh was going to ask his brothers a particular question. And he basically just tells his brothers, answer truthfully. Tell him that you're shepherds. Now, he mentions Goshen here, and it's going to come up again in a moment. Goshen was an area that was near the Nile River Delta. It was an excellent area for raising livestock. But it would also provide a buffer zone between the Egyptians and Joseph's family. As we're going to see in a moment in the story, the Egyptians tended to congregate in several communities, several cities. They weren't widespread. And so this would provide a buffer zone between them. As Joseph said, all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. So if the Egyptians felt like that their land was being encroached upon by the shepherds, tensions would build. And so Goshen was a place where the family of Joseph could go and they could begin to prosper as God had promised his great-grandfather Abraham years before. Second, Joseph submitted to authority with loyalty and accountability. Chapter 47 and verse 1 says, Joseph went and told Pharaoh, "My father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen." He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. Pharaoh asked the brothers, "What's your occupation?" "Your servants are shepherds," they replied to Pharaoh, "just as our fathers were." They also said to him, "We've come to live here for a while because the famine is severe in Canaan, and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen." Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock." And so Joseph and his family are received with favor by Pharaoh. God had promised Abraham, his great-grandfather, very early on, Genesis chapter 12 and verse 3, "I will bless those who bless you." And he is fulfilling that promise. Egypt is being blessed right now. And not only is this family given good land in which to raise their livestock, they're even put over the livestock of Pharaoh. You talk about a good business connection. Chapter 47 and verse 10 says, verse 7. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "None of your business." Oh, no, he didn't. He said, "The years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers." Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out of his presence. So from the time that he was born, do you realize Jacob's life was a struggle? You remember he was a twin? Remember at his birth? Esau is the firstborn, but Jacob's got a hold of his heel. He's already struggling before he's even born. And then he comes out, and he and Esau, they've got this sibling rivalry that goes on into their adult life. And then there's the struggles that he has with his father-in-law Laban. And then there's the struggles he has with his marriage to Leah. And then there's the struggle with the angel. And there's the struggle of grief over the death of his beloved Rachel. And also the supposed death of his son Joseph. And then there's the struggle with his boys who have gone bad. This guy is the walking wounded. His life has been about struggle. Verse 11 says, "So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed." Notice that, as Pharaoh directed. Do you work under someone else's authority? Most of us do. What is your spirit? What is your attitude like toward that person? And I realize that can be especially tough when that person is someone who's harsh, or someone who's difficult, or even someone who's incompetent. And it can be a test to your loyalty, can't it? But more than that, it can be a test to your spiritual maturity. Now, I'm going to ask you to turn with me over to Ephesians chapter 6. And as you're turning there, I do want to say there's a little bit of a misunderstanding, because in our minds, even though we weren't associated with American slavery, we still tend to think of slavery as being like it was in America 150 years or so ago. That is one form of slavery. Slavery appears in all kinds of forms throughout the world. And back during the Roman Empire, most people were slaves, but it was very different than our understanding of slavery. They would be much closer to our understanding of employees. It's different, but it's still closer to that than our understanding of 1800s slavery, okay? So when Paul writes to slaves here in the Roman Empire in Ephesians chapter 6, he's really speaking more to us in employee situations. And I want you to hear what he says in verse 5. "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly," catch this, "as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free." So as I said, Christians, we ought to be the best employees in the world. The third thing we see is Joseph's actions revealed his trustworthiness and his integrity. Chapter 47 and verse 13 says, "There was no food, however, in the whole region, because the famine was severe. Both Egypt and Canaan wasted away because of the famine. Joseph collected all the money that was to be found in Egypt and Canaan in payment for the grain they were buying, and he brought it to Pharaoh's palace. When the money of the people of Egypt and Canaan was gone, all Egypt came to Joseph and said, 'Give us food. Why should we die before your eyes? Our money's all gone.' 'Then bring your livestock,' said Joseph. 'I'll sell your food in exchange for your livestock, since your money's gone.' So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and he gave them food in exchange for their horses, their sheep and goats, their cattle and donkeys. And he brought them through that year with food in exchange for all their livestock." Now catch this. As the years go by, this famine is getting worse and worse. Life as they know it has deteriorated. It must have been maybe even worse than like during the Great Depression here in America, where people's lives, many people's lives, were just turned upside down and devastated. People are beginning to panic. Their very survival was at stake. And Joseph has been given this tremendous power. He actually held these people's lives. He held their future in His hands. Here is a perfect opportunity for Him to shave a little bit of money off the top. Here's a perfect opportunity for Him to line His own pockets. Because with the power He has and with the position He has under Pharaoh, nobody's going to question Him. But Joseph lived under the eye of God, and so he operated with absolute integrity. Someone has observed, I don't know who to give credit to this for, I just read it and I think it's true. They've observed that our affluence actually civilizes us. And they use the example of, we could find out real quickly how uncivilized and how barbarian we can become. It wouldn't take long if all the grocery stores in America just closed on the same day and didn't reopen. It's a tough task to keep hungry people, starving people calm. But Joseph did it, and he did it by believing in human dignity. He did it by not taking advantage of people who were at his mercy. And as you read on further into this chapter, you'll find that Joseph had everything. He had their money, he had their livestock, he had their land, he even had them. He had everything and they had nothing. They were completely at his mercy. Now, as we read on, I noticed that these people, though, didn't come wanting handouts. They offered whatever they could do to help pay for what they received. And because of our understanding of slavery in America and slavery in many parts of the world today, which, by the way, we in America don't realize this, but there are many experts who would tell us that there are more slaves on our planet today than there's ever been. But because of our understanding of slavery, we have a sometimes distorted historical view about it. In the ancient world, there was slavery like we would have known in America 150 years ago, but there was also another kind of slavery that we see pictured here. And it was really because they had no welfare system, it was a way of taking care of the poor, taking care of the destitute. And that's what's happening in Egypt right here. In all of this, Joseph handles things with integrity. Oh, don't misunderstand me. Integrity's tough. Integrity asks the tough questions. Integrity often takes the most difficult way, not the easiest way. And most of all, integrity reveals itself best when there's nobody else around. What is it we do? What is it we think when no one else is around? Finally, because he lived with integrity, Joseph gained the respect of others. Because as I said, at this point, these people have nothing. So Joseph came up with a very innovative plan. A plan that had never been thought up before. In chapter 47 and verse 23, it says, Joseph said to the people, "Now that I have bought you and your land today for Pharaoh, here is seed for you, so you can plant the ground. But when the crop comes in, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children." "You have saved our lives," they said. "May we find favor in the eyes of our Lord. We will be in bondage to Pharaoh." So Joseph established it as a law concerning land in Egypt, still in force today. Remember, that's Moses writing that. It's not still in force in 2015. That a fifth of the produce belongs to Pharaoh. Okay, as I mentioned, prior to this, the Egyptians have settled in just a few cities. And what Joseph is recommending is you got to give that up. And you've got to spread out across Egypt. And as you do that, I'm going to give you seed to plant. He's treating them with integrity. He's treating them with dignity. He is helping to make them self-sufficient. Did they buy into his plan? You bet they did. Look what they said in verse 25. "You have saved our lives." Yeah, they bought into it. Now, he did give them one stipulation. At harvest, you give 1/5 back to Pharaoh. You give 1/5 back to the government. 20%. You know, it's interesting. Throughout history, tax rates have pretty much been within a certain range, regardless of the country. Most of the time, it's run between about a third, 33 1/3%, up to 60%. Even today, in Europe and America and most of the world, the tax rates are somewhere in that range. So Joseph is being generous here. I would sign up for it. How about you? 20%. That's what he offers them. Now, why did his plan work? It worked because the people knew they could trust him. How did the people know they could trust him? Because he had lived a life of integrity before them. Listen, wise people don't live for others to respect them. That's not their motive, is for other people to respect them. Wise people live for God's approval. Respect is something that's just external anyway. Respect is how someone else thinks about you. It's what other people say about you. Character is inside. Character is who we really are. You can be a person of integrity and character, and there can still be people who are set on ruining your reputation. But they can never take your character away. Nobody can do that. The only person who can give up your character is you. So as we live for God, God forces us to deal with the hard questions of life. Rather than us dealing with a secondary question like, how do I make a living? God forces us to deal with the question, how do I make a life? And rather than the secondary question of, how do I get along with the people I work with? God forces us to deal with the question of, how are you and I getting along? Because you see, if we get those primary questions right, it's only then that the others have any chance of working out. So I want to leave you 3 verses to consider. Those of you who are currently working, I would encourage you to try to put them to memory. Put them somewhere where you can be reminded of these. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 31 says, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Colossians 3:17 says, and whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. Just a few verses later, Paul returns to this discussion. Whatever you do, verse 23, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for human masters. And I'm going to take the liberty of changing that and saying, as working for the Lord and not for human bosses. And so our challenge is that as we enter the workplace, as we enter the schoolroom, the classroom, be models of honesty. Be models of compassion, of integrity. Don't separate your life into the spiritual and the secular, but rather live integrated lives. Be positive influences as one who wears the name of Jesus Christ. Faithful representatives, faithful ambassadors to him who gave his life for us. And I would suggest to you this, because I titled this sermon as something about worship and on-the-job worship. We have in our history gotten real caught up about there being certain acts of worship that are done in a building on Sunday. And I'm not arguing with that, other than I think we haven't thought far enough. Because I think it's equally fair to say that the things we have talked about this morning are acts of worship. That as we enter into the workplace, as we take Jesus with us, as we live out the Christ life, these are acts of worship. This is on the job worship. And it honors the Father. So this morning we extend an invitation to any who might have a burden that they want to share, a prayer request, or you can go to room 102 and meet with an elder and his wife there. If you don't know Jesus, if you've never been baptized into Christ, come this morning and let us celebrate with you in that. Let's stand now and let's sing.
Give me the heart.